Japanese Jiu Jitsu has been around for hundreds of years. The term Jiu Jitsu or even Judo was originally an umbrella term to describe any sort of art that has hand throws, holds, or locks. It's not entirely fair or accurate to put a year on when the art was first devised or conceived of within Japan. Its Brazilian offshoot was developed in 1917 when Carlos Gracie watched a judo demonstration in Brazil, and this inspired him to learn the martial art, at which Helio Gracie further developed according to one theory. So Brazilian Jiu Jitsu has had more than 100 years of existence, practitioners, and further developmental theories and implementations. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu is a variation of Japanese Jiu Jitsu. The differences between the two arts can depend on how you view the implementation of either style. Most do now agree that Brazilian Jiu Jitsu has derived greatly from Japanese Jiu Jitsu or the original concept of Jiu Jitsu. It also comes from alternative names for the sport, such as Brazilian grappling or dirty Jiu Jitsu. A very effective argument as to explain and to notice the differences with the Japanese art and its Brazilian deviant is the methodology behind the application of techniques and practical strategy of use and implementation. The basic concept of practice with judo or jiu-jitsu is to get an effective grip on the opponent, unbalance them so they can't resist or counter your technique, and then throw them to the ground so that they no longer possess a threat to you. Hence, a direct and practical strategy for self-defense. So most judo practitioners put their focus on fighting from a standing position and look for the right opportunity to get a throw on their opponent. If both fighters end up on the ground, then and only then are there chokes, holds, or submission techniques to get a win or incapacitate your opponent. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu developed out of the ground fighting aspect of judo. Brazilian grapplers see the initial throw as the beginning of the fight rather than the end of it, or even going as far as allowing themselves to be thrown to get into a ground fighting position with their opponent to see what sort of moves can be implemented from that point on to perhaps gain an edge over their opponent with the grappling situation. This sort of interpretation of judo and jiu-jitsu cannot be so kind with the Japanese or certain practitioners in general. In an interview with Helio Gracie, Japanese judoka Nishi Yoshinori commented about the Brazilian approach to Japanese judo as being quote-unquote reckless. The Brazilian version of jiu-jitsu has been said by many to be a much more simplified version than the original Japanese art of jiu-jitsu or judo, and has been attested to be a major reason why it's so popular among martial artists or even people desiring to learn any sort of art. By having less to learn overall, and what does exist, practitioners are able to focus and master fewer skills. But a downside is that you can be arguably missing out on the whole aspect of the art to begin with. It's been said that why Brazilian grappling is so devastating in MMA is a combination of the simplistic approach to jiu-jitsu as mentioned, and the situations that the fighters can find themselves in, which is why learning and at least knowing some of the Brazilian style methods of jiu-jitsu is now essentially mandatory if you want to consider doing MMA or any sort of professional fighting sport or related competition. With the simplified interpretation of jiu-jitsu, it's as simple as taking them down, holding them, and using a lock or hold to force them to submit. It's that simple. Another criticism is that due to the simplified aspect of Brazilian grappling, once again, is that there is strength needed to force a hold and maintain grip is paramount. Bringing another person to the ground and to then use a lock, hold, or submission requires strength. especially if the opponent is more physically taller or bigger than you. Endurance to maintain grip is also extraordinarily important, especially if a fight or situation lasts more than a few minutes or moments. Traditional jiu-jitsu exercises all muscles of the body. Duels mention to the concept of throwing an opponent to the ground with grip dexterity being secondary. Once the opponent is thrown, normal strength is needed, but with Brazilian grappling, specific muscle work is needed. One exercise method recommended for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is to focus on exercises that have the largest amount of carryover into MMA. With this in mind, you would perform high repetition to develop muscular endurance and heavy low weight, low repeating exercises to develop strength. Force is developed by using moderate weights at maximal speed. With traditional jiu-jitsu, strength training was usually well-rounded. All core muscle groups are used in the concept of grabbing onto the opponent and then using momentum to throw the person. Some say that back strength is needed, especially if you were to throw an opponent that is taller or heavier than yourself as mentioned. One final difference or complaint that has arisen from Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is the simplicity or westernization naming of choke holds or grips. For example, the rear naked choke is actually called the haradaka jime, but the Brazilians nor the Americans will actually call the hold by its original name, rather to give another title or expression for it. These are just some of the thoughts and concepts for the differences between the original Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and its Brazilian offshoot.